making sure that you can anticipate, plan for, and mitigate those types of risks. The only way you're going to be able to do that is if you gather that boots on the ground intelligence. And that's what we advise our clients to do, is to build that into your process so that you can really make sure that you're verifying what you have on paper, what you're seeing there. And the only way you can really do that is to get that local knowledge.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Good morning, afternoon, and night, depending on your time zone, and welcome to another episode of Riskology. At Riskology, we combine the worlds of intelligence, business, and politics, help you understand how geopolitical risks and opportunities can help your bottom line. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Ian Oxnevad. I am the Director for Geopolitical Risk at Infortal Worldwide, and I am joined by my colleague, Chris Mason, our Vice President. How are you doing, Chris?
Doing great, Ian. Great to be back. Episode 2 is upon us. We have the introductory episode already out. Hopefully, some of you are able to join us and listen in to basically how we plan to approach geopolitical risk throughout this series. As we mentioned last time, we're going to do that in a lot of different ways. We're going to have guests. We're going to have discussions. We're going to hit a lot of topics. But most importantly, we're really going to focus in on how and why geopolitical risk analysis is important for business.
Yeah, it's been quite a busy week, but Chris has some stuff he wants to talk about Cuba. What's going on in Cuba, Chris?
It's really interesting. And again, circling back to, at the end of the day, we want to hit on how geopolitical risk can immediately impact business and actually create opportunities. Just this last week, a group of entrepreneurs, a group of business owners from Cuba actually convened down in Miami. It was a law firm down there, Ackerman, that hosted this event. And there was a bunch of entrepreneurs that came and sort of presented some of the challenges that they're currently facing in Cuba. And I know a lot of you might be thinking, wait, I thought it was completely closed off to business in Cuba. I didn't think there was any type of entrepreneurship going on. Well, this clearly illustrates that there is an emerging market that's really wanting to take off in Cuba. And what was surprising about the group of entrepreneurs is the fact that it wasn't just major industries. It was really cross-cutting across a lot of different areas and in a lot of different sized companies. So it wasn't just large enterprises. It was small and medium business. And you could definitely get the sense, or at least from the feedback from the event, that these business owners are so eager to do business with the United States. And of course, there's very heated political stances down in South Florida and even across the country when it comes to Cuba. But think about it, there's an area that could open up in the near future, and there's going to be a massive need for an influx of capital and a massive need for basics to really get businesses off the ground. And something that's easy to forget because Cuba's been so closed off is it's very close in proximity to the United States. And so that's something I would like to see as Cuba open up, of course. I think when you start looking at the politics and the military aspects of what's going on, that's where it gets a lot more challenging. China, of course, has been opening up to Cuba. There's talk of China building a SIGINT spy base down in the island. So a lot going on there, but some opportunities on the horizon. Ian, I don't know if you have thoughts on the Cuba situation.
Oh, do I have thoughts on the Cuba situation? I think we could do a whole episode on Cuba. To be honest, that's probably something we should do for a future episode.
Oh, yeah, I could definitely see that.
I mean, like, people don't know this, but Cuba before the 1700s and even into the 1700s was the economic, financial epicenter of the Western Hemisphere. It's a great location to be a potential financial center and even more tourist attraction. But what's going on with Cuba and entrepreneurs, it kind of shows that something that people don't understand is that even where the economy is otherwise outlawed, there's still economic activity. There's always a black market. And ultimately, when something opens up or liberalizes, it's that black market that then becomes the formal market and can court outside investment. from places like the US and others. So there's tons of opportunities to be had in Cuba.
Because one of the things we want to hit on today is the area of mergers and acquisitions. And if you think about it, we hit on Cuba. Once it's ready to go, once you're ready to invest, how can geopolitical risk analysis help you when you're looking at a mergers and acquisitions or a mergers or an acquisition situation? I think that would be helpful to sort of walk through that so that we can guide our listeners through how our services and how geopolitical risk analysis can really help in those situations.
Yeah. How do we find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow?
I think that the key, and one of the things that we keep hearing is there's a lot of dry powder out there, and let's hope that some of that dry powder is used fairly soon. Hopefully sometime in 2024, we see a rush or a gold rush. But I think the key is to really examine your current due diligence process when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, but also when it comes to seeking out your targets. Does that process include geopolitical risk analysis? Are you really looking at how changes in international relations, changes in conditions, things that can impact supply chains, as an example, are you factoring that into the analysis to really make sure that you're finding a good and solid opportunity? Because the last thing that you want is to pull together a deal. Everything looks great on paper, the valuation's set, you've got your team rallied behind it, you go for it, and then all of a sudden, a major international event just throws everything off course. And now you're throwing your valuation out the window at that point. Taking that step back and really looking at, are you incorporating geopolitical risk analysis into examining what types of companies, what types of areas and situations you want to enter into? Are you taking that into account? And then once you're ready to move forward and you're going through the full due diligence process, as an example, does your operational risk checklist include geopolitical risk analysis? Is it there? Is it mapped out clearly enough so that your team can look at those factors? And these are areas where we work with clients to basically look at integrating that into their current processes. But the key is really to assess what your process looks like and how you can integrate that analysis into the process.
Okay. Let's say I'm an American CEO and I want to go into Cuba. I want to go in all in. I bet it's the future of Latin American growth. What do I need to know? I see geopolitical risk analysis. I see intelligence. I see due diligence. And I see a bunch of local firms that I could invest in through an M&A deal. How do I do that? Where do I incorporate those three things? Intelligence, geopolitical risk analysis, and due diligence as I make that leap.
So if we're thinking about Cuba, and Cuba is opening up, that's obviously going to be a very complex situation with a lot of sensitivities from a regulatory standpoint. And so any deal that you're thinking about putting together involving Cuba is going to require a careful analysis of governmental relations and governmental regulations that could impact the business. So right off the bat, you're going to need geopolitical risk analysis to even begin to price the deal. The second thing you're going to have to look at once you jump into operations, and this will vary depending on what industry you're in, what type of businesses you're looking at, is what are your dependencies? Do you have a supply chain? And how could that supply chain be impacted by geopolitical risk events? That's where you start digging a little bit deeper. Now, of course, there's a lot of different paths we can go down depending on what industry you're in. But for this example, let's say that you want to actually have and grow a customer base in Cuba. You're going to hire a decent amount of local employees, and you're going to have some cross-border transport and commodities flowing from the US into Cuba. So kind of the perfect storm of things that you need to take a look at. One of the key factors that you need to consider, and this goes for all geopolitical risk analysis when you're thinking about it in a business context, is you need local boots on the ground intelligence gathered and pulled in centrally so that you can really get a true handle on what the business climate and the business cultural circumstances look like on the ground. And that's going to be extremely important if you plan on having a customer base in country, in this case, in Cuba. The other thing that you're going to have to look at is once you start having an operations presence in a foreign jurisdiction, you need to really take a look at how geopolitical risk events or tensions can impact those operations. So things like social unrest. We're seeing the strikes even here in the US or just across the pond in Europe. Making sure that you can anticipate, plan for, and mitigate those types of risks. The only way you're going to be able to do that is if you gather that boots on the ground intelligence. And that's what we advise our clients to do, is to build that into your process so that you can really make sure that you're verifying what you have on paper, what you're seeing there. And the only way you can really do that is to get that local knowledge.
Yeah, that's something that's so critical and overlooked because people nowadays, both governments and companies both, I think there's a fallacy, a fallacious assumption that you can get through these risks with a good attorney, good Google searches, and maybe a little help from AI. But you actually can't, because the fact of the matter is that knowledge is culturally contextual, and all of those risks and opportunities are also going to be culturally contextual. So if you look at even like the strikes right now in the US, you have European companies, particularly from Germany and the US, that are dealing with the strikes, and they're actually doing very well at mitigating those strikes. And that's a cultural reason for that, because unions, a lot of European companies, specifically Germany, unions and the executive, they work hand in hand, and there's often ties between them. They're very collaborative, as opposed to what you're seeing here with Ford. It's not going so well. And in order to track a crisis or detect one before it starts, you actually need those boots on the ground that can give you live, updated information. One of the key takeaways here is that intelligence, due diligence, and geopolitical risk are layered. It's like a layer cake, one on top of another, where it can assist your entire effort at conducting a successful M&A deal. Everything from valuation to knowing what relationships is your target acquisition. What relationships does it have? What about the people within that target company? Do any of them have existing liabilities or political connections that you have to worry about? If you're looking at putting a factory in place and there's a union already there, does that union have political ties? And if so, how does that relate to the legal system that you might have to turn to, God forbid, for legal recourse? Because that can affect your bottom line down the road. So these are all things to know. Like, where would that fit in the valuation? Or more importantly, what point of the M&A deal would this be most useful?
That's a great way of looking at it in terms of the layer cake and making sure that you're hitting all of the layers. One of the key places where this becomes really important is once you start conducting your operational due diligence, that's really where you want to get a sense of what's happening on the ground. And you want to think, you can't just stop at the national level. You can't just look at the interest rates. You can't just look at what's happening between countries. You need to really understand how the local politics look, maybe it's state politics, depending on the country, and how all of those things can impact your business. And right now, we're just sort of talking through it from a profit standpoint and healthy operation standpoint. The flip side, and the even more dangerous side, is the fact that this is where the corruption can hide. And so the other thing that you really need to get a handle on is, what is the business climate like? What are the customs and norms? Is bribery prevalent? Because in certain parts of the world, it's normal course of doing business. And so you can really set yourself up for trouble if you don't get that local understanding. Once you've got that, then you can come up with your plan. And if you've collected the right type of intelligence and you map out the due diligence through a structured process, you can also document the analysis that you've done, which in a recent case actually saved a company in terms of FCPA violations. I don't know if you want to hit on that, Ian.
Obviously, due diligence and intelligence can assist you at the front end of a merger, but how can it help you once a crisis emerges? Well, the answer is it can. Recently, there was a case involving Safran SA. This was a French company. Chris has more information on this, but in a nutshell, they uncovered corruption within their own operations and reported it. And because they reported, they actually mitigated their liability from a standpoint of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
This is a great example of really an area of law that's developing in the FCPA space, but it shows that there is value to doing a prudent and adequate level of due diligence. And so with the case of Safran, they acquired two companies that were operating in China, and these companies had bribed officials before the acquisition took place. And so they had paid for some pretty lucrative contracts. And so Safran, after they had made the acquisition, continued on with the relevant level of due diligence that they thought was necessary. And so they were actually able to uncover the bribery situation, which then allowed them to report the information to the relevant officials here in the United States, the Department of Justice. And because of that, they were able to actually receive the DOJ's 16th declination, and it put them in a strong position. So they didn't suffer from a reputational loss by any means. They actually did the right. They conducted the correct level of due diligence using boots on the ground intelligence to really uncover what was going on even before they had executed the acquisition. And so that put them in a strong position. They were able to move forward. And I think it shows you that the DOJ, when it comes to the FCPA, is really looking at the type of due diligence that you're doing and responding well when you're able to self-report, as was the case with Safran. So I like that example because it really shows you that you've got to be committed to really uncovering the bribery type situations. You can't just stop once you execute the deal, depending on what jurisdiction you're doing business in.
These are internal ways to mitigate liability, ultimately. And even if you have the sense that maybe there's no risk because the valuation looks good, I'm going to jump into this merger, acquire this subsidiary. At the end of the day, you're still adopting not only regulatory costs if you're wrong or if you turn a blind eye willingly, but you're also looking at reputational costs, potentially alienating or pissing off your shareholders or your investors.
Look, doing business abroad in certain jurisdictions, especially emerging markets, is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. And so you've really got to make sure you know who you're doing business with, what's going on the ground. But the regulators understand that there are going to be challenges. There are going to be situations that are uncovered. And the worst thing would be to just sort of sweep it under the rug. And so having that self-reporting option to really say, hey, look, here's the situation. Here's how we dealt with it. Here's how we plan to mitigate the situation going forward. That really goes a long way. And I think that's a positive step. So I hope to see it get more and more formalized.
Yeah, the Europeans seem to be doing this too, within the European Union itself, mandating these sort of internal compliance liability measures. And really, when you look at it, it's kind of devoted to different environmental or governance issues. But at the end of the day, it's internal compliance and intelligence and ongoing due diligence monitoring. And this is something that, unfortunately, a lot of American companies are still learning. They're still behind the learning curve on this because you don't want to be stuck in Russia post-invasion, metaphorically speaking, because that happens all the time with different issues. You get left behind and then all of a sudden you're forced to liquidate your holdings at pennies on the dollar and you get fined for both ends because you're in a geopolitical economic dispute. And the only way to really mitigate this and to cover yourself is to have these ongoing practices in place. That's what we're all about here at Infortal Worldwide.
Yeah. It's so important to put a program in place, as you mentioned, that your team can follow. Because what you don't want is for everyone's eyes to open once there is an enforcement action or once there is an issue. You want to get ahead of it. And operating in the US itself, it's such a vast and massive economy. A lot of the types of analysis and the areas that you need to focus on here in the US are very similar to what you'd need to focus on in an emerging market. It's just a case of formalizing the approach, formalizing the program, and making sure you're getting the right intelligence. Here in the US, if you're operating fully domestically, it's easy to get information. The challenge overseas, especially in emerging markets, it's hard to get the right information. And so you can't necessarily take at face value what people are giving you, even those individuals who are pretty senior and maybe sitting across the negotiating table from you. you've got to see what's happening at the ground level, flat out. But again, it's not as though it's super complex. There's complexities involved, but it's really just gathering the information and making a decision based upon the analysis of the intelligence, just like you would do here in the United States, just like if you're moving your operations base from Southern California into Texas. Similar exercise.
Yeah. The sort of notion that knowledge is power is the more accurate knowledge you have in a given situation, the more options are going to be available to you, the more time is going to be available to you, and ultimately a better outcome for your bottom line. You want to be the smartest person in the room, or at least the most informed when you're at the bargaining table for an M&A, and intelligence can do that. And as supply chains are constantly shifting right now, there's talk about globalization, not exactly ending, but sort of fractionalizing, where you have globalization on a micro scale and bilaterally and regionally and even sort of locally, away from this sort of US-China dyad that's been guiding everything for the past 30 years. That's changing because M&A is one of the main ways that companies are going to be reshoring or nearshoring their supply chains. This is something that they're all going to have to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a great way to almost close it for episode 2, because today we wanted to hit on M&A. What are the things that you can do as you're looking to invest, as you're looking at new situations? But one of the other areas we want to hit is how can geopolitical risk and how can geopolitical risk events impact your current operations, and what can you do to make decisions now to put your firm in a stronger place in the current globalized economy, which is, as Ian mentioned, constantly shifting.
Yeah. So with that, let's wrap it up. If you would like to reach out to us, please do. Please do visit us, www.infortal.com, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.